On March 6, 2003, an Air Alger Boeing 737 prepared to take off from Tamara 7 Airport in the heart of the Sahara. On board were 97 passengers and an experienced crew, but something was about to go wrong. A series of human errors unfolded, and within minutes, an avoidable tragedy became one of the worst accidents in Algerian aviation history. In the early afternoon of Thursday, the Boeing 737, registration 7TVJZ, operated by Air Alger, was at Tamanrasset Airport for flight DH6289 to Gardaia and Algiers. It was a Boeing 737-200 with nearly 20 years of service, having approximately 41,472 flight hours and 27,184 cycles. Despite being considered outdated technology at the time, the 737 was still widely used around the world. Flight 6289 was nearly full with 97 passengers, and its crew consisted of 2 pilots and 4 flight attendants. The captain was a 48-year-old man with 10,760 flight hours, 1,087 of which were in command of the 737. The first officer was a 44-year-old woman with 5,219 flight hours, including 1,292 on the 737. It was an experienced crew. All aircraft preparation was done by the first officer because the captain arrived late for the flight. The takeoff weight was calculated by the first officer at 48,708 kilograms, very close to the maximum authorized weight of 49,500 kilograms. Tamanrasset is an oasis in the middle of the Sahara Desert, where high temperatures and low humidity are constant. That day, the temperature was 23 degrees Celsius, which is hot for the airport's altitude of 1,377 meters. Altitude and heat make the air thinner, degrading engine performance and requiring more power and speed. Since the flight preparation was done solely by the first officer, at her request, the captain authorized her to execute this stage of the flight, meaning she would take off and fly the aircraft to its destination. A chief flight attendant was present in the cabin, talking to the captain during preparation, and was eventually invited to stay in the jump seat during takeoff. There were 4 flight attendants on the flight, each responsible for opening an emergency door. A flight attendant staying in the cockpit during a critical phase like takeoff went against safety regulations. Furthermore, the conversation between the captain and the flight attendant at that moment also violated sterile cockpit rules. In 1981, the FAA published a sterile cockpit rule prohibiting any crew member from performing tasks not associated with the safe operation of the aircraft below 10,000 feet. The first officer began the pre-takeoff briefing and announced the speeds for V1, VR, and V2. However, she was interrupted by the captain's conversation with the flight attendant. This lack of rigor in flight preparation also occurred during taxiing. At no point was there any dialogue regarding a possible anomaly during takeoff, as required by the procedures of any airline. At 14:01, the crew requested departure clearance. At 14:08, the tower authorized the aircraft to taxi for takeoff on runway 02. At 14:12, the tower cleared flight 6289 for takeoff. At 14 hours 13 minutes and 6 seconds, 6,289 announced takeoff. The engines were set to maximum power. The aircraft's acceleration and speed patterns were normal until the moment of rotation. At 14 hours 14 minutes and 5 seconds, the first officer requested landing gear retraction, and at that moment, a loud noise like a thud was heard. The aircraft's speed was 292 kilometers per hour. The height relative to the threshold of runway 02 was 24 meters. The plane began to veer left, and the first officer exclaimed, "What is happening?" The captain announced he was taking control, which was confirmed by the first officer. 3 times, the captain asked the first officer to let go of the controls, and each time she stated she had already released them. The first officer noticed the captain had not retracted the landing gear and offered to do so. However, there was no response, and the gear remained extended. At 14 hours 14 minutes and 15 seconds, the first officer informed the controller, "We have a small problem." The aircraft continued to climb, reaching a recorded height of about 120 meters. At 14 hours 15 minutes and 6 seconds, the stick shaker was heard and began operating intermittently. This device warns the crew when the aircraft is within 7% of stall speed. The aircraft's height relative to the runway threshold was a maximum of 122 meters. The speed was 134 knots, or 248 kilometers per hour. At 14 hours 15 minutes and 10 seconds, the GPWS Don't Sink auditory alert was heard. At 14 hours 15 minutes and 15 seconds, a second Don't Sink alert sounded, and the plane hit the ground. The fuselage broke apart, and only one passenger, seated in the last row, survived. A fire started immediately. Voice and data recorders were recovered and sent for analysis. Both engines and their main accessories were transported to Brussels, Belgium. The investigation showed that the problem originated in the high-pressure stage of the turbine, located just after the combustion chamber. A rupture of a relatively large part, due to material fatigue, caused the immediate destruction of the high-pressure turbine and consequently damaged the low-pressure turbine, causing a sudden drop in rotation speed and engine thrust. However, the engine did not shut down. Losing an engine during takeoff is a scenario trained extensively and should not have been the cause of a catastrophic accident. However, there was a reduction in the perception of performance readings, and the lack of a takeoff briefing meant there was no mention of visual warnings. The crew was suddenly confronted with an emergency situation for which they were not mentally prepared. Another decisive factor was the captain taking control of the aircraft without any request from the first officer or the use of standard terminology. He did not trust the first officer, and she, in turn, completely abandoned the role of pilot monitoring. The captain took the controls in a critical situation and adopted a pitch attitude that was incompatible with the failed engine. Following this accident, authorities recommended that Air Alger ensure its CRM training programs increase crew awareness regarding control transfer procedures and task sharing. Additionally, it was recommended to create an independent organization to inspect procedural compliance and a permanent organization for civil aviation accident and incident investigation in Algeria.